following technology people, right? Because we're gonna break this down. We're gonna have a little fun. What do you say? So, yeah. So as Jim said, for 20 years I was a sports agent and represented some incredible athletes, coaches, broadcasters, guys and gals that woke up every day and often, as Jim mentioned, executed on a world stage. So for 20 years, like you, I had to negotiate at times with them, whether it was negotiating their fee with us or negotiating opportunities and challenges that we had to help them navigate through. But then I also, of course, negotiated for them. And with 300 athletes and coaches waking up every day, this was my world, like yours, every single day. And what the world thinks is that, wow, Molly, negotiation is just a battle. It's a war. I mean, you got to get on the other side of the table and you got to go maybe at each other a little bit. That's what it looks like. But with 300 athletes and coaches in almost 2 decades, what I learned is really the problem is that isn't what it is. That what I found was that the more I had a great connection with the person that I was negotiating with, the stronger the relationship, the more quickly I could close deals and I could close even better deals. To me, it was about connection more than anything else, getting on the same side of the table with general managers, with reps from Nike so that I could connect, not just to get a great deal, but to get the next one done even faster. So I want to walk you through some of the mistakes that I made along the way, which there's plenty, and some of the things that I saw work so that most importantly, you can lay it over top of the world that you live in, of the deals that you manage, and the way that you do it so that it'll help you maybe leave here doing it with a little bit of a different perspective. So I want to talk about the 5 most common mistakes I saw with negotiation and what to do instead. So number 1 is not knowing who you are negotiating with. One of the things I talk about is having 360-degree awareness with the people that we're negotiating with. In other words, knowing what matters most in their heads and hearts to the people that we're dealing with. Do you guys know the name Ernie Johnson? Ernie Johnson's on TNT. He's flanked by Charles Barkley, which is a big personality, and Kenny, and sometimes Shaq. So we represented EJ, and we were negotiating one of his contracts with TNT. And so like I always did before any contract negotiation, like I know you do, I prepared. And I pulled back and I looked at every other guy in the market like EJ. What did they make? What was their base? What were their bonuses? How many units were they doing? How many times were they on the air? I broke it all down and built sort of a database, if you will, so that I could prepare for framing up with EJ what I thought he should get paid. So I frame all this all up, and EJ comes up, Ernie Johnson, and sits down in the office, and I walk him through what I think we can make, how we can set a record with this deal, how that we can be on the crawl on ESPN and get more money than any guy that sits in this role has ever gotten. I sit down with EJ and walk him through it, and you know what? He looks up at me and says, Molly, you know what this is about? And I said, what's that? He said, my son Michael is severely disabled. He said he can't talk very well, he can't walk. I don't know how long he's going to make it. He said, all that matters to me is that I can bring Michael to work with me sometimes. That Michael can come and roll his chair up and watch Charles and I and Shaq do what we do. He said, that's what matters to me. I don't care if I'm on the crawl making more than the next guy. He said, I want Michael to come up. He said, I want to use this platform as a way to connect with endorsements and sponsors that live in this space. He said, all Michael's ever wanted is a pair of custom Converse. He said he can't ever walk, but that's what he wants. He said, that's what matters most to me. I think so often when we negotiate, sometimes the mistake that we make is not knowing what matters most to the person that we're negotiating with. Getting in their head and heart matters a ton. I was negotiating a contract with a general manager in Major League Baseball. And I sit down with this guy. I had a veteran pitcher that had pitched in the league for almost a decade. So we had a lot of choices. We had 30 other clubs that were interested in him coming to pitch for their organization. So I sit down with this GM of the team that he had pitched for before, and I start talking to him about the deal. And as we're talking, all that this GM wants to talk about is the base salary, the bonuses. He said, this is what matters most, the financials. That's what John, the GM that I was negotiating with, what mattered most to him. That's all that mattered was how much am I going to have to pay this guy? How is it going to impact my payroll right now. And all my client and I were worried about is, what's the direction of this club? Are you going the direction that we want to be associated with? What's this clubhouse going to look like? They were making a change with their pitching coach. Who was that guy going to be? And oh, by the way, could my client bring his clubs on the road? Because when he wasn't pitching, that's what mattered most to him. So what I realized as I reflect now on those relationships and that conversation is the general manager I was negotiating with was only worried about the finances. That was all that mattered to him. What mattered to myself and my client was sort of what's the overall direction of the organization. We were looking at it from a very strategic perspective more than really a financial perspective, candidly. And so what I've learned is, how do we make sure that we know how we show up at the negotiation table? In other words, how do we come to these conversations? How do we come to these negotiations? And how do the people that we're negotiating with show up? So I'm going to ask you to do a little participation with me. Does that sound fun? So on the screen are a bunch of words, and I want you to think about the way you show up at the negotiation table. When you're beginning to negotiate a deal, do these words connect with you as it relates to the way that you show up? In other words, are you real logistical? Are you really analytical? Are you real factual? Are you focused mainly on financials? Are you real fact-based? Who in here, raise your hand, shows up at the negotiation table or inside of these conversations, as I like to call them, focused on these kinds of things? Raise your hand. All right. So you are focused on the financials. You're a little bit like that GM I was negotiating with. How many people show up thinking about these things? They're more sequential, consistent, reliable. You want to avoid risk. You're thinking about the execution. You want to sort of establish order to the process. How many people connect to these words, that you show up like this? So you're showing up pretty logistical in your approach to these conversations. What about people, and by the way, you can have more than one, but most of the time we show up at the table in sort of 1 to 2 of these primary sort of personality traits. And there's no right and wrong, right? We didn't decide whether we're going to be left-handed or right-handed, right? It's how we're wired. How many people show up thinking about things like this? You want to tell stories. You're worried about encouraging others. You want to build the relationship. How many people show up like that? Raise your hand. Awesome. All right. So you're a little bit more relational in your approach, right? How many people show up thinking about these things? You're strategic, you're innovative, you're real visionary, you're creative in the way that you come to the table for these kinds of conversations. And like I said, by the way, you could have 2, but usually no more than 2 in the way that you show up. How many people show up like this? Wow, we've got a lot, huh? How many? Strategic? Raise your hand. Do you show up like this? Okay, all right. So you're strategic. And so what we call this is that we're showing up. What I realized as I look back at my conversation with that general manager is he was coming at it totally financially based. I was more strategic and logistical. So had I done a better job of approaching the conversation more focused on the things that mattered most to him and weaving in the things that mattered to us as part of the conversation, which is what negotiation is, wow, maybe I could have connected more. And at the end of the day, right, when we connect inside of negotiations, we keep the conversation going. Negotiation's just a conversation. It's a difficult conversation sometimes, but it's really a conversation. So the more that we can connect, the more we can keep the conversation going. And the more we can keep the conversation going, probably the closer we get to a deal. We call this 360. I wish I would have done a better job as I look back at that of thinking about and showing up, leading the conversation with the things that mattered most to him. So when we think about negotiation mistake number 1, right, how can we make sure we have 360-degree awareness around what matters most to the people that we're negotiating with? Negotiation biggest mistake number 2, negotiation is a transaction. No, negotiation is a relationship. I'll tell you a fun story. I graduated from Michigan State. I played tennis there. Go green. Where do I got to go green? Awesome. Yeah, go green. So I graduated. When I graduated, I had played tennis at Michigan State, and I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, by the way, and then I was such a big girl, right? I moved 2 miles away to go to college. So after I graduated, I looked at my mom and dad, and I said, look, I think I want to move to Atlanta because the Super Bowl was coming to Atlanta, the Olympics was coming, there was a ton of stuff coming to Atlanta in the sports space. So I said, I think I want to move to Atlanta and try to find a job in sports. And my parents think, well, This ought to be kind of interesting, right? Honey, like, how are you going to fund your little excursion to Atlanta to find your dream job? Because we're not. And I said, look, I'm going to teach tennis all summer in town here, and I'm going to save as much money as I possibly can, and I'm going to take whatever I have, and I'm going to move down to Atlanta and try to find a job when I get down there. So I teach tennis all summer. I save $2,000. So by the end of the summer, right, I'm loaded. I've got $2,000. I'm at my parents' house. I go down the hall to my mom's closet, by the way, and borrow this bootleg polyester awful blue suit. I hope no one's wearing one, by the way. So I borrow this blue suit because I think, gosh, maybe I'll get a meeting, and I got to act like a grown-up. So I get the suit. I get in my little Honda Accord. I'm backing out of the driveway of the house I grew up in, looking up at the top of the driveway to my mom and dad, who are literally my best friends in the whole world. And I see my mom and dad, and I think, wow. And I see my mom kind of start to tear up, like she's starting to choke up. And I see my dad look at her, and he nudges her, and he's totally disgusted. And I can read his lips. He says, really? She will be back here in 2 weeks. Right? This is a no big deal. You know what I mean? So I back out. I get down to Atlanta. A girlfriend of mine from high school was amazing. She gave me the names of 3 people in Atlanta who taught tennis, for a living in Atlanta. But my coach said, look, Molly, I know that you don't want to be a tennis pro forever, but these people are in Atlanta. They teach tennis. Call these people up and maybe they'll help you. So one of my friends from high school had a little 1-bedroom apartment in Atlanta. And so she said, look, Molly, you can live with me for a little bit until you kind of find a place to live and find a job. But you can stay here at 600 square feet. It's going to get tight fast, but you can sleep on the couch until you figure this out. So I get down to Atlanta. I've got my $2,000. It's down to about $1,700 by now. I have been eating, by the way, grapes at the grocery store for 3 days, right? You won't drop dead, by the way, if you don't wash them, just so you know. I'm proof. So I get down there. I wake up the first morning at my friend's apartment, and I pick up the phone, and I call, one of these tennis pros that my friend had given me the names of, my coach. And I get on the phone with this guy who teaches tennis, and I said, hey, I'm Molly. I played tennis in college. I taught a little bit. I said, man, I'm just curious, do you know some people in the sports space in Atlanta? And we're kind of talking and connecting, and I'm asking him for advice, and very nice guy. And as we're talking, he said, Molly, I don't know if you know this. He said, but in Atlanta, tennis is a big deal. He said, like, for example, people teach tennis at their apartment complexes for a reduced rate on the rent. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, like, they teach 1 hour a week to anybody that lives at the property that wants to come. And in exchange for that, the property gives them just a little bit off their rent every month. And I was like, dude, I'm calling you from my friend's apartment. I slept on her couch. I said, I need a deal like that. He said, you know what, actually, he said, a really good buddy of mine, he said he just got engaged. He's getting married. He teaches tennis at an apartment complex around the corner from where you are. He said, and he's going to be leaving that property. They're going to need a tennis pro over there. He said, but the manager over there has no idea that she's about to lose her tennis pro. He said, you better go over there. And I said, absolutely, right? So I get in my little car, drive over to the apartment complex. I walk in, and the manager was there, and she was very nice. And I said, hey, how are you? I'm Molly. I played tennis in college. I've taught a little bit. I said, do you guys have a tennis court here? And she said, oh, yeah, we do. It's awesome. We have this tennis pro. She said, he's amazing. She said he teaches every Tuesday night to anybody that lives here that wants to come to the tennis clinics. And I said, oh, that's cool. She's starting to pitch me on an apartment. And I said, well, listen, if anything was to ever change, with that pro, I said, man, I would love to talk to you about teaching here. And she said, oh, yeah, no, he's been here forever. Everybody loves him. We're totally good, but really appreciate you coming by. And just sort of at this point, right, she's thinking, get out of here. So I hand her my just bootleg, homemade, paper-thin, awful business card. But boy, was I proud of it. So I hand her my little business card, and I said, well, let's stay connected. And she said, absolutely. So I get in my car, and I'm driving back to my friend's apartment. And as I'm driving, I drive under the bridge, and I look over, and I see this little, what looks like kind of a little one-off little restaurant. It's called Pero's Pizza. It looks like a little mom-and-pop kind of spot. So I see this place, and I think, man, I wonder if they sell a lot of pizza to that apartment complex because it's really close. I mean, it's like I don't know, man. It's probably like my 9 iron, your 6 iron-ish. You know what I mean? Away. Picking up what I'm putting down? So I see this spot, and I think, I wonder if they sell a lot of pizza at this apartment complex. So I think, what the heck? So I pull up my little car, and I walked in, and I said, hey, it's called Pero's Pizza. So I said, hey, is Mr. or Mrs. Pero here? Kind of a good bet, right? Out comes Mr. Pero. I said, hey, Mr. Pero. I said, you know that apartment complex across the street? He said, yes. I said, do you sell a lot of pizza over there? Because, gosh, I mean, there's like 1,100 units, a ton of young people that live over there. I bet they would all love, a $15, $20 dinner. And he said, wow, I mean, I guess we sell a little bit, but I don't think a ton. And I go, well, what if we did something where, like, let's say once a month. Once a month, you give me like 15 or 20 pizzas for free. I'll give them to people that come to the tennis clinics, get them excited about Pero's Pizza. If you'd let me, I'd take a coupon from Pero's. I'll stuff it in the newsletter that they give to the residents that live there at the first of the month. And he said, so 15, 20 free pizzas one time a month, and you'll stuff a coupon in a newsletter to 1,100 front doors. I said, yes. He said, I love it. I said, awesome. Here's the thing, though. I said, I don't have a deal over there yet. I said, but here's the thing, Mr. Pero, I am really, really close, okay? So when I get it, I'll be back, and we'll get this done. So just keep it right here between me and you. And he goes, well, I really like it. And I said, no, I promise. I got you. I'll be back. I get in my car. I drive back to my friend's apartment. I call my buddy at Wilson Sporting Goods who gave me tennis rackets when I played in college. So I called my friend Rick. I said, Rick, I'm down here in Atlanta. I'm trying to get a deal to teach tennis at this apartment complex. I said, don't you in your office down the hall have like a closet with water bottles, keychains, T-shirts, like a bunch of Wilson gear in it? And he said, yeah. I said, could you do me a huge favor? I said, could you go down, put a box of all that together, send it down to me in Atlanta. I'll give it away to people that come to the tennis clinics, get them kind of pumped about Wilson stuff, right? You can give me coupons, whatever. You can send them to local retailers. He said, wow. He said, you were always a treat in college. He said, I'd be happy to. So the next day, 1:15, my box comes in. Well, I wake up that first morning, though, and my favorite place in the world at this point is Kinko's, right? So I go to Kinko's, and I print these tennis tips I'd made for a little local magazine in Lansing when I lived there. It was, probably very poorly written, but they were little tennis tips. And I thought, we could reuse these tennis tips, put them in the newsletter, get people excited about the tennis program. So I print all these little tennis tips. There's like 50 of them. I grab my box. It comes in from Wilson at 1:15. I drive over to the property. I walked in. The manager was there again. I said, hey, how are you? I'm Molly. I came by the other day, and I'm standing there like this with my box. And she goes, oh, my gosh. She said, you aren't going to believe this. And I'm standing there like this, and I said, what's up? And she said, the tennis pro came in this morning. She said, he's getting married. He's moving out. She goes, we need a tennis pro. And I'm like, no. I mean, this is amazing. Like, this is incredible timing, And she goes, yeah, this is really wild. And I said, well, gosh, I was just actually coming by. I was going to drop off these tennis tips. We could put these in the newsletter, get people, pumped about the program. And she goes, wow, this is cool. And I said, and these are these bunch of gear from Wilson. We could give this away to people that come to the tennis clinics, And she said, God, this is so cool. She said, like, this guy we had was amazing, but, man, he didn't do any of this extra kind of stuff. And I said, yeah, no, this is great. So I said, how did it work? What was the deal? And she said, well, like I said yesterday, every Tuesday he taught for about an hour, hour and a half to anybody that lived here that wants to come to the clinics. And I said, cool. How did it work financially? And she said, well, the rent's $850. What we did was we gave him $500 off the rent every month. And I said, oh, wow. I said, that's awesome. And I said, listen, you're not going to believe this. I said, there is this restaurant right across the street. I go, these guys are amazing, right? Like, they'll hook us up with like 15, 20 pizzas for free. Once a month, we can give them away to people that come to the clinic, get them excited. If you'd let me, I'd stuff a coupon in the newsletter. We drive traffic back to this place. I said, everybody wins. She goes, God, this is incredible. Like I said, this guy, like, he didn't do any of this stuff. And I said, yeah, no, this is great. I said, but this whole like $850, $500, write a check at the beginning of the month for the difference of $350. She goes, yeah. I said, why don't we just waive it? you know? I mean, I was like, don't you think that'd be cleaner? You know what I mean? Easier. She's like, what? I said, let's just waive it. I'll move in. We can keep, the momentum going from the program. She goes, well, geez, I got to go back and call my boss, and see if we can actually do this. And I said, yeah, no, that's cool. I have no job, I'll wait, right? So she goes back. She comes out 10 minutes later. She said, you're not going to believe this. And I said, what? And she said, I told him about this Wilson stuff, these tennis tips, this restaurant thing across the street. She goes, you're good to go. She said, in fact, we'd love you to move in as soon as possible. I lived in this little apartment complex for free for 9 years. It was sick. Yeah. That's awesome. But I tell that story because, and in fact, it's kind of funny. There was this guy who came to my tennis clinic. He met his wife there. They got married. They moved out, right? And then about 3 years later, he sees me in the elevator, and he had sadly gotten divorced, and he was riding up the elevator with me 3 years later, and he looks at me and he said, hey, Molly, you're the tennis pro. He goes, God, you're still here teaching tennis? And I said, yeah. And he goes, man, you are throwing money down the drain, girl. You got to buy something. And I'm like, I know, right? It's crazy, right? So, but I tell that story because when we think about what we all do, when we think about negotiation, to me, it's all about the relationship. It's about how do we think about that relationship as somebody that we can add value to their lives. And really, oftentimes, that's so counterintuitive to the way that we think about negotiation. We don't think we should necessarily add value to their lives, but at the end of the day, sometimes when we add value, we take things off people's plates, we show them what this relationship will look like, and we can maybe get deals done a little bit more quickly. When we think about negotiation as a relationship, I'll tell you about a mistake that I made that I love to tell this story because I hope candidly it offsets you making a similar mistake down the road. So Billy Donovan, who's an NBA coach now, was a client forever. Billy was the head coach of the University of Florida, men's basketball. Go Gators, right? Well, you'll know this story, right? So when Billy signs with us because he wants to go to the NBA. Billy was at the Gators at Florida, and he had won 2 national championships at Florida as their men's basketball coach. He'd had a lot of success. But Billy came to me and he said, look, Molly, I am just exhausted. I want to go to the NBA. I want to coach 80 games and get out of this grind of college basketball, which is a grind at times. And he said, I want to go to the NBA. And I said, well, okay, Billy, we can do that. I said, but you've won 2 national championships at Florida. You're a heck of a basketball coach. I said, you have a lot of choices, so we need to be really careful what NBA job you go take. And, of course, Billy agrees. And so a little bit of time goes by, and I get word that the Orlando Magic job is going to open up. Okay, so Billy's in Gainesville at the University of Florida. This is the Orlando Magic. Billy has 4 children. He's married, and I thought, this really could be a nice move for him, logistically, right? It's still in the state of Florida. It's pretty close. This could be interesting. So I called Billy up, and I said, look, man, I think this Orlando Magic's job is going to open up. I said, is that a job that you'd be interested in? And Billy said, wow. He said, absolutely. And I said, okay, cool. Well, we got to wait till they fire their coach until the job's open before I can make the call. 2 days later, they fire their coach. Now the job's officially open, and Billy wants us to pursue it. We get clearance from Florida to do that, which is part of the process. I call the Magic and talk to them about our client, Billy. And I said, look, we got a guy that's really interested in this job. And they said, who is it? I said, Billy. They said, wow, this is the truth, which is so unique. They said, he's actually the number 1 guy on our list. He said, this is interesting. They said, let's go. Let's try to figure this out. Let's do it fast before the media gets involved. So for 4 or 5 days, I'm literally just kind of going back and forth with Billy on the base salary, on the bonuses, right? On all the terms of the contract. So back and forth on the phone with him, 4 or 5 days. It started on about a Sunday. We wrapped it up on about a Thursday. So I'm going back and forth, right? I got him a couple car deals, a country club membership, right? What the heck? Private school funding for the kids, why not? Private jet flights, 10 of them for Christy until they actually moved the family to Orlando. So the deal's pretty sweet. Billy's excited. By Thursday, we're at $27.5 million deal. Billy's pumped. The Magic are pumped. We're ready to go. So we've locked and loaded the terms of the deal. So now the Magic want to announce, of course, their new coach at a press conference. So we fly, my agent and myself, we fly from Atlanta to Orlando. Billy flies, lands. We get in a car and go over to the arena for Billy to do a press conference. So we walk into the arena, and Billy is so chill, so calm, so comfortable really with this move. We get into the boardroom, and Billy executes 6 original contracts. He signs all 6. He signs some basketballs for some of the fans and sponsors. I'm standing in this boardroom. I'll never forget it. I look over. There's a glass window. And down below is the practice court where the Magic are often practicing. But here's where they're going to hold the press conference. So there's media everywhere, from ESPN to the local media in Orlando. They're all there waiting to announce the new coach. So I look at Billy and I said, man, this place is packed, dude. You are going to be here for a while. So we go down. Billy sort of sits at the front of the room and answers the questions. He does a great job at the press conference. Then we walk around. He talks to all the media. Terrific. And this was actually on a Friday. So we finish the press conference. We fly back to Atlanta. He flies back with his wife, Christy, to Gainesville. I get back to Atlanta. I grab a couple of the folks on my team, and I said, hey, let's go celebrate, right? We just took Billy to the Magic. He's excited. I said, this is awesome. So we all meet at this beautiful restaurant, right? We order a ridiculously awesome bottle of red wine. I heard you were doing a little bit of that last night, by the way. So we get this amazing bottle of red wine, right? And halfway through the bottle of wine, Billy calls. He said, hey, Molly, listen. He said, I want to bring one of my assistant coaches with me. He said, would you call him, call the team, and do that deal? He doesn't have an agent. We like referrals in life generally, right? So we said, great. So literally call the assistant coach, call the team, and start that deal. So we ordered another bottle of wine, right? Just being real. So that was sweet. The next morning at 7:30 in the morning, I'm cooking breakfast for our 3 daughters. I'm an awful cook, and I'm standing in my kitchen trying to make breakfast, and my phone rings. 7:30 in the morning. These guys, as you can imagine, never knew what day it was or what time it was. So Billy calls, and he said, hey, listen, Molly. He said, that Magic's job. He goes, I don't want it. He goes, look, never mind. I need you to do me a huge favor. He said, I need you to call the Magic, tell them I'm out, and have them rip up all 6 of those contracts. I'm going to stay at Florida. I mean, I'm like, whoa, Billy. I said, well, gosh, man. I said, we need to make really sure you're clear about this, because if we pull out of this deal, it's going to be a while before probably you can go back to another NBA team. And Billy said, I know, I get it. And I said, I just want to make sure you're clear on what this might look like. Can we get on the phone with Christy later and talk through it? And Billy agreed. And so I hang up the phone, and I'm standing in my kitchen, and I remember thinking, what just happened? Like, how do you go to a press conference, sign 6 contracts, go to the Magic? I said, how did we do that? And now, no, thank you. I don't want that deal. And what I realized as I stood there so clearly was never one time inside of those 4 or 5 days that we were going back and forth on the base and the bonuses and the cars and the country clubs and the schools and all that. Never one time did I say to Billy, hey, man, just so we're connected, are you ready to walk into that locker room at Florida and look at those young men who you love, who you've recruited, some of them since they were 14 years old, and say, hey, listen, guys, I'm going to the NBA. Are you ready, Billy, to do an exit press conference at Florida and say thanks to all the fans that have had your back through the good and the bad, and say, I'm out of here. I'm going to the Magic? Are you ready to sit with your athletic director who's had your back and say, I'm gone? Are you ready to do all that? I never asked the tough questions. I never asked the real questions. The deal was terrific. The terms were great. Have you ever done that, right? Like you finish a conversation or a deal and you say, beautiful. They didn't bring it up. They didn't ask. They didn't ask about fees. They didn't ask about timing. They didn't ask about, this is great. So to me, those are the times in which we need to ask the questions so that we connect. Because when we connect, right, we can do deals with these people again. We build connection. We build trust. So I just say it's so important to remember the mistake that I made in that Billy deal was I was way too transactional. I wasn't as relational as I needed to be. The other thing that I think is important is to remember to stay curious inside of negotiations, right? To not get defensive inside of these conversations. So I was sitting in a meeting with the head of golf for Nike, and I was negotiating a deal for one of my golfers. And I'm sitting in his office, and as I'm sitting there, I'm with one of my other agents. It was early in my career, and there wasn't a whole lot of women in the business. And so I'm sitting in his office with my male agent, and all that this gentleman from Nike was doing was talking to the male agent. And he wasn't really looking at me, and I really ran point on this athlete, and so I was really point on the process. But he was really having the conversation mostly with my counterpart, my male counterpart. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, I was getting more and more frustrated with the way this was progressing. And so all of a sudden, I'm thinking, wow. And so behind him, though, in his office, I see his screensavers on his computer. And the screensavers are images of golf holes at Augusta National, which is a really beautiful, of course, golf course about an hour and a half east of Atlanta. So I start to recognize these golf holes. They're rotating, they're flipping, and I'm getting more and more frustrated with the fact that this guy isn't giving me the time of day. So as I'm having this conversation, and not really, as I'm listening, all of a sudden I looked at him and I said, wow. I said, your screensavers. I said, that's Augusta National. I said, wow, look at that. That's number 12 at Augusta, that beautiful par 3, with the azaleas in the background. I said, wow. I said, I'm sure you've played it, because he's the Nike guy for golf. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I have. And I said, that's unbelievable. I said, what'd you get on number 12, that unbelievable par 3? He said, oh, he said, yeah. He said, I parred it. And you know how, I don't know, how ladies, sometimes guys can sort of say, oh, yeah, 7-iron in, against the grain, putted it in, and right. So he goes through the whole thing. He said, yeah, I parred it. And I looked at him, and I smiled, and I said, man, listen, you're not going to believe this. I said, but I played it last week, and I said, and I birdied it. Yeah. In that moment, we connected, right? We connected. One of the things I think so important inside of tough conversations is we can easily find ourselves getting defensive. But the more curious we can get versus being defensive, the more we can connect. And as I said, the more we connect, the more we keep it going, right? I'll tell you a fun personal story. So, do we have parents in the room with children, right? Yes? Okay, cool. It's amazing, right? What a gift. And so my husband and I have 3 daughters at times, right? So my husband and I have 3 daughters, and, they were about 6 years old. And by the way, we had 3 kids in 12 months. That's a whole nother story. We had 1, and then I had twins 12 months later, right? Talk about a real live fire drill, right? So I'm in there with my daughters, and they're all really needing a lot of the same things at about the same time. And so they're about 2, my twins are 6, and our oldest one is 7. And I go into the orthodontist to get braces. And, nowadays it's just a total racket, because now you get 2 phases of braces, right? Many of you may know this. So I go in for the first phase of braces. They're 6, 6, and 7. And I walk in, and they do a whole sort of, preview of all 3 of my girls' sort of mouths, and they all pretty much look like landmines, right? So the orthodontist says, look, here's the deal. All 3 of them need braces. And I'm like, shocker. And he said, so here's how this is going to work. He said, why don't you go back and sit down with Renee, who was sort of the office manager, and she'll walk you through kind of how this works. So I sit down with Renee in her office, and she opens this folder up, and she said, yes. She said, so, we can do all 3 girls. We'll keep the braces on for about 2 years. She said, it's $3,000 a daughter, $3,000 a girl. And I said, oh, wow. And she said, yeah, so it's $9,000 over a 2-year period of time. And I said, oh, okay, cool. And I said, and by the way, the office is packed. It's in a great location. This guy has a terrific reputation. And I looked across the table at Renee, and I said, wow. I said, so like, you just invoice us monthly for this? And she said, well, yeah, we can figure out how you want to do it, but typically it's monthly. It's a small down payment, and then you sort of pay us monthly. And I said, God, you do this for everybody? She goes, yeah. And I go, how many braces do you put on a year? And she said, oh, thousands. I said, so you're invoicing thousands of people every month all through the year? She said, yeah. I go, do they all pay? And she said, sometimes they're late. And I go, that's got to be a nightmare. And she said, oh, yeah, it's a total nightmare. And I said, listen, what if we, you got to invoice people, and I mean, what a pain, right? And I said, God, I know we need to do this. I said, but what if we did this? I said, what if we did all 3 girls, we do the plan you're talking about, but I pay you cash, $6,000 up front, you never have to invoice me. She goes, what? And I said, yeah, like $6,000 up front, everybody wins, we just sort of pay it up front, and then you don't have to deal with invoicing me over this multi-year period. And she goes, wow, well, I'll go ask the docs if they'll let us do that. So I sit there, she comes back, right, and she says, deal. They love it. Takes time off my plate, right? I share that story because to me, the more curious we can be inside of conversations, the more that we can believe, too, that everything is negotiable. Everything's negotiable, right? Inside of so many moments in our lives, the more that we can be curious versus defensive, the more that we can connect. We call this 360 discovery. So inside of a conversation, I always challenge people to talk to the people that you're negotiating with about what matters most to them. What are they most worried about? What's working? What's not working? When you look at this model at the end of the day, that was kind of what I tried to do inside of my conversation with Renee at the orthodontist. 360 discovery. The fourth mistake I often see is that everything has to happen at once. Everything has to happen at once. We talk about how game changers embrace the pause. So I'll tell you a fun story. I was negotiating a baseball player's contract, and he was inside of arbitration, which meant that, gosh, if we couldn't come to terms with the team, then, now we had to put the player in a room with 3 perfect strangers to decide what my guy was going to make. I never liked going to arbitration because I kind of felt like maybe I had not done my job as well as I could have. So I had a baseball player, he was an outfielder, and he was really arbitration eligible. So we had about 4 months to try to come to terms with the team and avoid arbitration. So for 4 or 5 months, I'm going back and forth with the general manager, and we just have a nice, fluid sort of process negotiating. My client was pretty firm on what he wanted. So for 4 months, literally, we're just going back and forth and back and forth. We cannot come to terms on this deal. My player's really confident. He's firm. He's comfortable, he says to me, to go to arbitration. But, of course, I don't love it. So I go to bed that night. The next morning, I'm flying to Phoenix, Arizona, where the arbitration hearings are happening. So I go to bed that night. Sadly, I used to sleep with my phone. I don't recommend this. So it was by my bedside table. It's 11 o'clock at night. I'm sound asleep. My phone rings. The GM is on the other end of the phone, the general manager. And I said, hey, how are you? And he said, I can't believe this. He said, I called my buddy at Delta Airlines. They've confirmed with me that you're on that flight to Phoenix. He said, I can't believe it. I thought you were going to call me and cave. And I said, no, Frank, that's really where we are. We believe that's fair. And I just paused. 11 o'clock at night, I'm laying in bed. It's a minute and a half. Nobody says anything, which is kind of weird, by the way, for a minute and a half on the phone with nobody saying anything. My husband's laying next to me, and literally after about 30 seconds, he says, is he still there? Right? And I'm like, shh. About a minute and a half later, all of a sudden, Frank, the general manager at the time, said, unbelievable. He said, Molly, he said, congratulations. He goes, you guys got a deal. He said, I'll email you over the term sheets right now. I, of course, quickly called my client. He was pumped. We didn't have to go to arbitration. But I tell that story because I think so often when we negotiate, we think that it all has to happen at once. I think there is so much power in our ability to pause inside of negotiations. And the truth is, sometimes a pause can be a month. Sometimes it can be 2 weeks. Sometimes it can be a week. Sometimes it can be a minute and a half. But when we pause, we send a really, really powerful message to the people that we're negotiating with. We send a message that I mean what I say, and we really are where we are. And if we have built a great relationship with the people that we're negotiating with, we can pause. And we can know that because there's a relationship there, they're not going to walk away. I believe the pause is incredibly powerful, and is particularly powerful when you've built great connection with the person, of course, that you're negotiating with. The other thing I think about the pause, I was recruiting a baseball player who I had for almost 24 months been recruiting. We have a long sort of sales cycle, and as I was recruiting him, I mean, we did all kinds of stuff for him, right? We brought him endorsement deals. We brought him appearances. We brought him, I did a camp for him for young kids. We flew him to the All-Star game when he was in the game. For 24 months, literally, I behaved in a way like we represented him, but we didn't officially yet. So he was going to be a free agent, which is obviously when we wanted to officially sign him so we could represent him. So 23 months into this recruiting process, we sit down at dinner and we're ready to have him execute the agreements. And so we sit down at dinner, and halfway through the dinner I said, "God, Andrew, hasn't this been fun?" I mean, and I'm reminding him of some of the stuff that we've done together. And so I'm going through all that, and all of a sudden Andrew looks across the table at me and he said, "Molly," he said, "you guys have been amazing. I mean, I can't thank you enough." He said, "But here's the thing, I just can't leave my agent." He said, "He's been there since I got off the boat from Curacao to America." He said, "He's like a brother to me," right? The truth is, I could have asked him that question in a bit of a safe and different way in month 1 of this 23-month experience. I could have said to him in month 1, "Andrew, tell me this, man, what do you love about the guy that you're with?" And he would have said, "Molly, he's like a brother. He's a dad. He was there when I got off the boat." He said, he's literally like my brother. And I would have known right then he was all set. He was good. But you know what? The mistake I made, I never paused. I just kept going. I kept going. I kept executing. I kept delivering value, which was fine. But had I paused inside of that and asked some questions, had I gotten a little bit curious, I might have been able to get that information and save myself a whole lot of time. So I would encourage you to recognize there is so much power in the pause. And the more we can utilize that pause, the more that we can hopefully drive toward a deal. Mistake number 5 that I often see is not asking with confidence, right? I believe it's so important to ask for what we want with confidence. Imagine, for example, that I had walked into that orthodontist office, and instead of saying, "Hey, how about we do this? How about we do $6,000, I'll pay you up front, you never have to invoice me, and we get this thing done." Imagine if I would have said, "Hey, maybe what we could do is I could save you, from," right? And I had asked with the tone and the timing, in other words, with the way in which we ask for what we want matters. If I had asked for that orthodontist deal in a way that was different without confidence, boy, we send a different message. If I had asked that apartment complex manager for that deal without confidence and without paying attention to timing, it might not have worked, right? To me, paying attention to the tone and the timing in the way that we ask for what we want matters so much. I always say, too, by the way, that if we want to get a deal done, we want to try to do it live, right, in person, not through email. If you don't want to get a deal done, right, throw them an email, right? To me, that's so true. So when we think about asking with confidence, I'll tell you how I sort of got into the sports agent business. I started with a small agency in Atlanta, and we had about 4 athletes. We had 4 clients. We had 3 NBA coaches and 1 baseball player. And so I started with the agency, and my job was to go out and get endorsement deals for the athletes and the coaches, the athlete and the coach that we represented. That was my job. I was going to go source deals for them off the court or the field. And so about a month into the job, I'm sitting in my office, and I had gotten a whole bunch of free sunglasses from Oakley for for our guys and some prospects. So I'm sitting there in the office, and I'm literally sorting through these sunglasses in my office. And then I started thinking, I thought, what is our how are we growing our agency? How are we signing more clients? How are we growing and bringing on more talent? Because, of course, in the agent business, being able to bring on more talent was integral to the way that we were going to grow. So I thought, what is our strategy? So I popped up and I walked in. We had a small agency, and the CEO was across the hall, and I said, what is our growth strategy? How are we growing and getting more clients? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, how are we signing new coaches, new baseball players? What's our strategy? And he said, all referrals. It's all referrals, and it's worked great. He said, our NBA coaches have all referred each other, and one of them referred our baseball player. And I said, well, gosh, what if we got more aggressive and went out and recruited athletes and coaches? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, that's what I mean. What if we got and built a plan to grow these divisions? And he said, well, of course, I was probably wearing a pair of pink pants, and he's thinking, lady, you didn't play in the big leagues. How's that going to work? And so I said, look, could I put a business plan together for you on how I think we can grow our baseball division? We had 1 baseball player. There was a lot of opportunity in Atlanta, I thought, to grow that division. So I said, what if I put a plan together for you for us to do that? And he said, well, sure, go for it. So I pulled back and I took about 2 weeks. And I built a plan for how we could go recruit more baseball players. And then I would go down to Georgia Tech and lean on the fence. We had a bunch of a bunch of first-round projected guys coming out of Georgia Tech, which was about 10 minutes from our office. So I would go lean on the fence to recruit these young players because fortunately my boss had blessed me to go try to grow this division. So I would lean on the fence, and there were scouts and parents leaning on the fence, and the scouts had chewing tobacco on one side of their lip and bubble gum on the other, so I just packed a fat chew and mixed it. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. But I tell that story because it was an opportunity to ask for what we want with confidence. It was an opportunity to demonstrate how we could grow, I think the way that we ask for what we want sends an incredibly powerful message. When I walked in there and asked him, when I showed him the business plan, doing those things with confidence sends an incredibly powerful message. So as you leave here today, I would just challenge you to pick one thing. One thing that maybe you think is a way in which you could shift so you could approach these conversations better. I would challenge you to remember that negotiation is just that. It's just a conversation. And the better the relationship, the quicker we can close deals and the better we can close them. I'll leave you with this one story. When I was leaving East Lansing to head to Atlanta, to head to Michigan State, I was taking one last tennis lesson with my coach that I had worked with since I was really young. And I'm sitting there at the lesson, and I walk into the lesson with this coach that I loved. He'd been my coach forever. And I walk out on the court, and he says to me, Molly, today we're going to do a little something different. He said, we're going to play sharks and minnows. And I said, what do you I mean, I'm 18 years old. I'm like, well, sharks and minnows, what? He said, here's the deal. Inside the tennis court, the main part of the court are minnows, but behind that is the baseline. And behind the baseline, there's sharks. And so you can't step backwards. He said, you can't step behind the baseline or you'll get eaten by the sharks. He said, you've got to step in. He said, you've got to lean in. He said, I want you to cut off the angle. I want you to take the ball on the rise, and I want you to go for it. The truth is that tennis lesson for me was a metaphor for life. When I embarked on a business where there was nobody else that looked like me, there was no other women in that space. I couldn't wait for someone else to go first. I needed to go first and lean in. I needed to cut off the angle. I needed to step in and go for it. So as you embark on difficult conversations, I hope most importantly you'll build connection and step in and lean in and go for it. Thanks so much. Have an awesome couple days.